I'm happy to introduce three great speakers for this panel. We have, I will take you in the order of my screen, and I will start with Catalina Goanta. Catalina is an associate professor in private law and technology at the University of Utrecht. We have Daza Greenwood, who is the founder of Civics.com, a legal tech consultancy. I hope I got that right. And last but not least, we have John McCaskill, who is a clinical professor of public and non-profit management at the University of Texas in Dallas. So I hope the short introductions did you justice, and I didn't miss out any details on your professional and most certainly very impressive CVs. So we've, in the past few days, been talking about the complexity of the systems we analyze in computational antitrust. And John, you co-authored a paper which explores the potential of using something called complexity science to design a good antitrust policy for blockchain. So John, I will give you the floor, and if you could present your paper and tell us what it's all about.
Certainly, thank you very much. This is the paper that my colleagues and I worked on here for looking at blockchain and how computational antitrust could be involved. So I'd like to touch on three areas that we covered in the paper. The first is a discussion of the relevant concepts of complexity sciences and introducing regulatory environments as complex adaptive systems. Next, the implications for blockchain and antitrust policy, examined from this perspective, and then finally a proposed generalized approach for developing an agent-based model for examining the evolution of blockchain. So in the past decade, blockchain has been quite disruptive, right? It's been become ubiquitous, but at the same time, it's got a whole lot of things going on with it. So at one level, blockchain's merely this tool for distributed, so at one level, blockchain's merely a technology that enables distributed, encrypted, and secure logging of digital transactions in an add-only ledger. So what's all the fuss about? It's only a tool. Well, it's been suggested that blockchain has the potential to upend competition law completely. So this paper basically provides an intellectual framework consisting of complex adaptive systems and path dependence perspectives, and the methodological tool of agent-based modeling to explore the dynamics of the antitrust regulatory environment. So what are these things, these complex adaptive systems? Well, they're typically characterized by multiple entities, actors or agents that interact in dynamic ways with their behavior adapting and evolving over time. They're a system of systems, if you will. So such systems are prone to nonlinear types of processes that make them extremely difficult to model using traditional linear statistical techniques and methodologies. So examples of CAS in the literature include the dynamics of the biosphere, various group-based behaviors, which would include competition and cooperation, cultures, global economic dynamics, international politics, segregation dynamics, and many more. So given the complex and non-linear dynamics that may be present in complex systems, a new theoretical and methodological tools are required. So ABM is one of those tools, which would also include cellular automata, genetic algorithms, and neural networks that seek to examine complex phenomena that may not always be amenable to traditional methodological approaches. So agent-based models provide a means of evaluating various hypotheses using simple rule-based systems. These models are designed to evolve in generative or bottom-up processes that may be impossible for the traditional formal top-down models of complex phenomena. So the agents thus emulate boundedly rational economic agents responding to complex and uncertain market conditions. So And then coupling this with path dependence, which recognizes that the options available at one particular point in time are limited by the choices made at some earlier point. And North argues that path dependence is crucial for understanding the evolution of rational political and economic institutions. So an essential element of literature addresses path dependence and the question of market efficiency. So Arthur stresses that path dependence processes are non-ergodic and promoting multiple equilibria with increasing returns in many possible future trajectories. So moving from there over to agent-based modeling, Caligotlia and McCall propose a generalized agent-based model for modeling a blockchain system. So our specific contribution in this paper is to expand upon Caligotlia and McCall's research involving blockchain technology. So in doing so, we're informed by Schreppel's work on the impact of blockchain technology on competition. There are always, there are ways that agent-based models have been used to test for these exclusionary abuses. And one very successful market example was conducted by researchers with the Argonne National Lab regarding electricity markets. So in their investigations, industry experts in each sector of the market were consulted and engaged in a participatory simulation approach. So by running through several iterations of the electricity purchasing cycle from generation to transmission to distribution to consumption, the modelers were able to identify agent behaviors in various market conditions. So these behaviors were then programmed into the agents within the computer simulation. And in doing so, they discovered that there were behaviors that agents representing the generation companies could have a dramatic impact on the spot price of electricity. So while electricity is a commodity that is purchased from the lowest bidder, the generators can withhold capacity. So if there's not enough electricity provided at the pre-negotiated rate, then the spot rate applies. So the less electricity the generators offer to make up the difference between supply and demand, the higher the prices go. So those generators that held back supply to sell into the ancillary or spot market stand to make significant profits as the bids for electricity accelerate upward. While this possible strategy was considered and noted during the participatory simulations, it was considered an outlier strategy due to the levels of risk assumed by the generators. However, when programmed into the computer-based simulation, it became the dominant strategy after multiple iterations of the market cycle. So with this model in mind, and using these same techniques, it's possible to design an agent-based model to test how monopolization practices could be implemented by others in a market. And just to give a bit of a brief example, this is an example of a net logo screen, which is a common and free software for doing agent-based modeling. And the simulation, just to explain what you're seeing in this, on the upper left-hand side, you see the simulation controls, and the output graph on the bottom left is part of this simulation or the software, and then the graphic presentation on the right shows the agents moving across and interacting in the simulated terrain. This particular simulation is a representation of what's known in the net logo library as predator prey. You'll notice the little white sheep and the dark wolves moving across a field of grass, and all of these are basic agents or units that are under study, and they're controlled up in the upper left-hand corner. So in the past few years, there's been a growing number of scholarly articles that leverage a complex adaptive system perspective to examine blockchain technology. And it has applications beyond conventional cryptocurrencies, which are probably the thing that comes to mind most frequently when we look at these things. But these are particularly, blockchain has particular application in regulating complex markets. So it has the potential to address other key issues, such as regulating sand extraction and trade, enabling peer-to-peer energy markets, and reducing drug counterfeiting. So there's a number of these areas that are seemingly interrelated, but are all going to be able to benefit or use some level of blockchain technology. So Pour, Tartar, and Gorge leveraged an agent-based model to examine the regulatory or the regulation of sand supply. So while sand supply seems niche, it's an essential industrial material for the construction of concrete, glass products, and electronic components. In areas where economies are rapidly expanding, there's a high demand for sand, which is creating a serious environmental impact in countries like China and India. So this has this has dramatically affected rivers and has led to lower water tables. And then given the highly decentralized and complex supply chain, this is a challenging regulatory issue for many to address in countries. So using blockchain technology to implement smart contracts will help manage the supply responsibly and sustainably. And so to demonstrate the feasibility of this, Pour et al. Leveraged agent-based simulations to examine the decentralized network of industry agents, mining agents, and government agents in this ecosystem. So just to conclude, there are some limitations of agent-based modeling. And to quote George Box, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So ABMs are reductive approximations. So the key is to ensure that they're illuminating. Verification and validation is critical in these models. So the key essence here is, do the models faithfully and repeatedly recreate behavior seen in the past? This is the validation of these models, so we have faith in them as we look to things in the future. So the models aren't necessarily meant to predict the future, but to explore what is possible in the future. So with that, I will yield the floor, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, it's fascinating how these agent-based models could identify computational concerns there where our classical models could not necessarily. Daza, I would like to ask you what your views are on this subject.
Thank you. So I agree. This is really fascinating work, and I am particularly happy to see you trying to apply complexity theory and agent-based modeling in particular in the area of antitrust, because that's a very good example of what I would consider an aspect of computational law and should be encouraged completely. One observation I had was I wonder what application you think the underlying algorithms you'd have for modeling the economic activity, how that might work if, instead of having basically a corpus or several corpora of data that you're taking to represent the system, the energy system, for example, or any other, and instead imagined that the systems had, let's say, a set of relevant APIs that were doing business reporting, financial reporting, maybe they're publicly traded companies. What if the data was continuous and real time? What issues and opportunities would that raise for using this approach?
Well, it would, I think it'd be a fascinating way to do this. I don't see that there would be any real technical obstructions to doing this. It would just be a matter of properly programming and using it. So I am a basic neophyte, relatively speaking, with using agent-based modeling, and I would certainly need to work with some of my computer science colleagues to be able to effectively incorporate that data, but it's the thing that's kind of fascinating about this is that you can actually vary these parameters as the simulations are running. So you have the opportunity to stop, update, or even continuously live stream update if you wish on some of these parameters, and to adjust the and to adjust the rheostat, if you will, on what's going on some of these parameters, which makes it really interesting to then be able to do sensitivity analyses on some of these variables, and it just lends itself to being able to do things that you can't do in the real world without causing a whole lot of angst to those that you're studying, but yet giving policymakers the opportunity to see where these things might go, given their full run of course, if you will. So it's kind of I can't recall I'm repressing the gentleman's name that referred to this as being an aircraft simulator. So you can take an awful lot of this data and have it fed in, and it's not going to necessarily tell you what's going to happen, but it's going to give you a range of possibilities that can happen. So it's a lot better to test out your emergency procedures while you're in a fixed simulator that won't smack into the ground than if you're actually trying to work on these things while airborne. Yeah.
Indeed. And then, if I may, with a follow-up.
Sure.
Absolutely.
The other thing that occurred to me, well, first of all, I really take the point of not trying to re-engineer an aircraft in flight. But the reason I was asking had really more to do with this next kind of question, which is to look more closely at the relationship between this modeling and antitrust itself. And I was wondering, did you have in mind this type of approach for detection of potential antitrust violations, or, and this is what the connection I was drawing when I read the paper, perhaps to monitoring the effectiveness of interventions that might happen as a result of an antitrust action. It's in the monitoring and the adjusting of decrees or other regulatory actions where we maybe get into re-engineering things in real time, or perhaps at least adaptively and dynamically.
There's been a group and they're mentioned in the paper that have been doing things with electronic medical records that's used agent-based modeling in conjunction with blockchain to work on these things and to try to prevent fraud and these types of things they're doing it as they're running. So that is possible. That's beyond my level of expertise and what we're doing, but I am aware of groups that are doing these things in different sectors. So I think this is certainly an area that would be ripe for further exploration, particularly in integrating the computer science aspect of the programming to be able to do this in real time, to present a dashboard. It's sad to say my son would probably give a much better explanation of this. He's a data scientist, but that's his area. He's doing and using for integrating GIS and satellite imagery real time at the Bureau of Reclamation for monitoring some of these very sensitive watersheds and how they're going to adjust that. So expanding this out to blockchain, I don't think would be much of a stretch at all, particularly to enable some of the watching. I guess you would just run into some of the other issues of how we get the information. right? Where you're plugging into privacy.
I think Catalina also has very interesting views on that. Catalina.
Yeah, thank you so very much. Greetings from the Netherlands. And first of all, let me just give Thibault and the entire Stanford Computational Antitrust team a very big shout out, because this is a fascinating event. It's really one of the kind in the world. And I think we really need to be very grateful for seeing it come together also a second time in 2 years. And John, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful to read your paper. And I think that you're really onto probably the most important topic of our generation, namely the complexity, not only of behavior, but also of the legal frameworks that are applicable to different types of behaviors on digital or offline markets. And so I think that your reliance on complexity theory, complexity sciences, and also the bringing of literature from agent-based modeling is really a very innovative, contribution to the computational antitrust discussion. I think it also echoes some of the work that has been done by Daniel Martin Katz from Illinois Tech on legal complexity. So that's more on the side of just looking at laws as a complex system in themselves. But again, I think that this is going to be one of the most important themes that we will see emerge in the next decade, because we notice that it becomes an overwhelming, kind of background issue, a very bugging issue for a lot of the types of problems that we're trying to solve in digital markets. I had two very specific comments and questions, and I very much look forward to your ideas on that. So first of all, you were also mentioning in your presentation the dimension of agent-based modeling simulations, right? So these are models that are supposed to simulate different types of behaviors, and depending on your data, this is also what Daza was mentioning, then you can simulate various types of behaviors in various types of circumstances. And then you gave also this example of the energy market. So then there's this very nice idea of redistribution. So especially in a world where we need to be much more attentive with resources, and resources need to be allocated more efficiently because of the fact that that is just a very physical limitation that we will be dealing with also increasingly in the future, then simulations really hit the mark in terms of trying to understand how to best shape these reallocations. Taking that in the context of computational antitrust, and also the dimension that also Daza was mentioning, the idea of having authorities involved in these types of modelings, I was wondering how you see what would be primarily two types of activities. So on the one hand, investigations for very specific antitrust issues, and then also enforcement for very specific antitrust issues. And Daza already touched upon this with his own question, but perhaps one thing that I would like to emphasize is the predictive aspect is something that in many different fields is now being very much criticized because of the fact that it can lead to different types of harms. And, with automated decision making, in administrative law, it's very clear that the harm is very individual, but then perhaps you can also think about more market level harms, depending on how such profiling and also simulating can be used in the context of this either investigative dimension or also the enforcement dimension. I guess that we can also think about a third way, the idea of just collecting evidence for policymaking. So maybe that would be something a little bit more detached from very specific infringements. But one question that I had for you was, do you foresee any kind of pitfalls or also any kind of negative externalities of using these technologies when it comes to the parallels with other automated decision-making technologies that are very much under fire because of the fact that there is a focus on the kind of harm that they can cause, or maybe harm would be a little bit too much for the context of a market discussion. So perhaps we can even speak about accuracy or some type of harm that can arise out of accuracy issues. So perhaps I'll just address this question and then I'll come back to the second point. So I'm very curious about your thoughts on this.
Okay, well, thank you. You make several terrific points in there. And the thing about agent-based modeling is that they are very powerful and useful tools, but we can't see them as the single answer, because if you try to put too much faith in their predictive power, the simulation doesn't necessarily predict anything, it just demonstrates the possibility. So it's the thing, and that was why I found that example from Northern McCall on the energy markets in an attempt to deregulate. So that was what they were attempting to do, and so they got several experts together to try to determine what market behaviors would be, and everybody said, you know, that's this whole withholding capacity was a dangerous play, that no generator in their right mind would ever do that. Well, in the simulation, it went to show that over time, it became the dominant strategy because these agents learn from each other. So it's this whole idea that perhaps in conjunction with using something from the top down, we can have something that shows what happens from the bottom up, because these agents have rather simple behavior patterns. So but they learn. So it's much like what people do in reality is, you know, they're all trying to get by. They're all trying to, you know, get ahead, do these other things. So they've got these heuristics and these motivations that they're using. So what is possible when these things begin to interact? And I think the main thing that the simulations are good for is to demonstrate these possibilities. And it does make me a bit nervous when people say that, well, I want to do enforcement action off of this. It's like, well, where are you getting the data for? And so the human in the loop is probably the critical area in here, and the safeguards obviously there need to be guardrails, because these things are, people see it and it demonstrated it, and the software demonstrated it, so obviously this is true. Well, no, that's not that's really not a good way to approach it. And so, you know, like you say, that we need to be cognizant of many of these pratfalls that can occur when we're trying to understand something, not to jump to the conclusion, well, this possible correlation is causation. It's maybe not that. It's just the Eleanor Ostrom and a lot of her writing, which is not to do with is to do more with common pool resources and the avoiding tragedy of the commons type thing. She focuses on the importance of contextualization and the second, third, fourth order effects of these decisions and these interactions. And so that's kind of more of what we can demonstrate with the simulation, and not necessarily say, this is the one right way, or no, you're guilty, and, you know, to heck with you.
Completely, I'm absolutely with you on this. And every single time when or at least the way in which I perceive agent-based modeling in a kind of a metaphorical manner is by comparing it to psychohistory. So the concept, I see Thibaut mentioning futuristic in the chat. So the sci-fi book by Isaac Asimov Foundation, or the sci-fi series, where psychohistory is basically this agent-based modeling supermodel that pretty much aims at trying to predict the behavior of society as a whole. So what I'm hearing from you now is you're saying, well, we're really far away from that, even when it comes to the very specific market situations. And we should also just take that with a grain of salt, because perhaps we can use agent-based modeling in such a way to inform us about different trends or different possibilities, but then not so much as to really nail that and say, okay, this is the result of this type of model, therefore we need to have some sort of interventions on the market because of that, like regulatory interventions.
Right. Well, or to get into that, I think the movie was The Minority Report, where
Exactly.
you're about to do something bad, so we're going to arrest you now.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's really fascinating how these things can get going, but it's again with any of the simulation and basically with any of these computational tools, even in the hiring process, it's the programmer and the people that are building the software are going to have their own biases inserted in it. So is it much better than what the human was? That we can't get away from the human biases that get introduced into these things. We can only that's why it's better to explore versus direct from it, I guess.
Absolutely. And Bjorn, do I have time for another question if I make it like really short?
If you make it very short, you can ask.
Wonderful. Yeah, so perhaps, John, I just also wanted to ask you about perhaps the limitations of applying this agent-based modeling kind of framework to the blockchain sphere due to the very high adversariality that exists in this entire domain. So what I was wondering is, what if then you can do agent-based modeling of agent-based modeling? Could you actually just really get to a meta level of computing movements in such a domain where basically maybe the benefits of using it in blockchain behaviors, let me put it like this generally, would also be somewhat turned into pitfalls, because then it becomes this type of reinforcement situation where everybody tries to guess the moves of everybody, and then basically the technology becomes a little bit, it kind of becomes maybe not necessarily that useful anymore. So any thoughts on that?
When you ask that question, it reminds me of these black boxes that they have in trading in the stock market, because that's exactly where that's gone, and so now we get Schrodinger's market, where we have flash crashes and all these other perturbations in the market caused by that. So I think that's a real concern. And I had not thought of modeling, but that's a real. I'm going to have to think about that. I haven't done that. That's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm going to have to get some of my colleagues together and see what they see where they go with that, because that seems like a really fascinating. That's a great idea for a paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Daz, I think you wanted to make a small comment before on the reliability of these agent-based models.
Nothing's coming to mind on that topic. May I ask, why did you think I was going to say that? Maybe that will trigger my memory.
You unmiked yourself, but please feel free to say anything.
Oh, okay, sure. I guess I'll take the prompt to say, of course, we should always bear in mind the reliability and accuracy of any agent-based model has to be under continuous scrutiny, because it's a simulation with, only a tiny amount of information about reality. And so, it's an aid, not like a complete God's eye view of a definite reality, of definitely what's happening or what will happen, or even what did happen. Anyway, what I was thinking was a little bit different. And I was starting to, well, it was your comment about the psychohistory from Asimov that got me thinking, and then you sort of postulate. They never say what the algorithms are for the big machine in the sky that in this fictional universe starts basically orchestrating the economy and doing many things for the greater good, and that speculative question has opened up again now because of some remarkable advances in generative AI in particular that have just been cascading over the last 6 or 8 months, but in particular over the last week. I don't know how many of you are familiar with or have had a chance to play with ChatGPT in particular, but that to me it represents a profound breakthrough. And actually to your supposed question about the reliability, not because it's 100% accurate all the time, for every situation, not at all, but because of what it can do. So it has some remarkable capabilities to have a kind of an internal representation of a model of a situation, including complex legal situations, and to start to reason about and then provide, full text or even code and technical models and other types of code base to answer questions and sort of in a dialogue chat way about things that are happening. I know Thibault, if you follow him on Twitter, like me, has been exploring this, in his case, in antitrust. I've been exploring it for autonomous legal entities and automated contracts and other areas where I feel a little bit more confident, and it's remarkable. So anyway, that's the long-winded way of saying, kind of raises the question, what might be the combination of artificial intelligence and other analytics type techniques that such a fictional AI would use? I imagine it wouldn't be solely agent-based modeling. It would probably be a complex, mosaic of things. And that kind of raised the question in my mind here of what is the role of agent-based modeling for antitrust regulators, for compliance people, for economists? What is it good for, and maybe where does it fit in the sort of mosaic of approaches and computational techniques that we might be able to deploy? And so, I mean, it's sort of a high level question, but I'm trying to get my mind around what the applicability of this agent-based modeling technique might be, and where it may not be as good, and how people would know when to use it appropriately. What do you think?
Well, I think the main thing is that it's these simple systems that or these complex systems that have very, very simple rule-based things going on are able to generate these emergent behaviors that can really surprise us. And I go back to that the electricity market again, where all the experts within the markets thought that withholding capacity was an outlier, that was too high a risk, and these people had too much at stake to be doing this, but that over time, that you could generate these things for these cycles enough times in the market to see that all of a sudden, people have learned what's going on, and you know what, they're going to this is a possibility that no one thought was really going to ever emerge, and yet it does within the simulation, and you can look back and go, oh well, of course, but it allows some degree of not necessarily prognostication, but of providing warning signs, perhaps. So it's not saying there's ice on the road ahead, slow down. It's saying there's a possibility of ice on the road ahead, slow down, type of thing. So and then it's up to the policymakers to then go, how concerned about this are we? Is this something that is, an oh my gosh, what are we going to do if that happens? Then if saying that that's necessarily going to happen. So I guess it kind of comes back to the almost to the planning process, where you would have the most likely course of action from a competitor, the most likely most favorable for you, for them to do, and then the most dangerous for that if they do this, oh my gosh, do we have an answer for this? And you would obviously try to mitigate that type of thing. So I think that's as it currently stands, at least in my mind, that's what I would suggest people to use, is this, oh my gosh, is there something dangerous out there that we want to be sure to mitigate its possible impacts? Because an awful lot of these things, you get into these fat tail distributions of probabilities, particularly when there's not much experience with it. So that's kind of I would think that's where we would be the most useful, at least at this point.
That's really helpful. And I sort of gleaned that from your paper and your remarks, that it's almost sort of like forward detection. And I guess the specific legal context and regulatory context there might be, is there a need for some action, right, some intervention? So if you don't mind speculating with me for a moment, and actually I should probably mention, I think I was introduced as founding civics.com, the consulting company, which is true, but I'm actually here today in my MIT capacity.
Okay.
And so in an academic, free-for-all, intellectual, open greenfield spirit of exploration and just speculation, I wonder if we could think through the possibility of utilizing these techniques after, or even as part of, say, a settlement decree or some antitrust regulatory action, whether it's the breakup of a company, denying a merger, or some other type of action. Lately, I've been talking with people about data divestiture as a possible remedy, which is, there's some precedent from that from a long time ago, but that might be, for example, a way to break up some of the negative consequences of the concentration of power with some of the larger companies on the internet with their personal data, for example. And so in some of these, in any context, not necessarily blockchain at all, but any antitrust context, what's the possibility to build agent-based modeling in to basically measure the effectiveness and the performance of interventions, and then perhaps be able to adapt what those interventions are after the fact, as opposed to as a forward detection warning sign?
I think that'd be a great way to use that, because because the critical elements are having the experts there to be able to do, use Delphi techniques or whatever to look at what this ecosystem, what the critical variables are in this ecosystem, and then be able to build them into the model. And what are the behavioral ranges that these different agents would have, and some of the and then the terrain, however you're defining that, in that logo they call them patches, but how the patches would respond to various actions by these agents as they're moving around and interacting, and being able to program that in and have it, and then look back and say, yes, in fact, this happened, and we're able to predict this, and we've got reasonable fidelity with these variables that we've chosen. Now we can start adjusting things. Well, what if we would have done this? And to do perhaps these, I think, if I'm understanding your point correctly, to do these alternative histories, and then to bring it to the present. If these things would have happened, where would we be in the present? And then maybe be able to then extrapolate these possibilities as we go forward. If we've got these interventions in place now, what would this look like going forward? And yeah, I think that would be a terrific use for that.
Yeah. That's very, very interesting. I hope John answered Des's question correctly. I'm sure he did. And it was
very
extremely interesting.
You definitely did. To confirm, you asked if you understood me correctly. You did, and I agree with Bjorn. You answered it marvelously, and you really gave me a lot to think about how to maybe to try to apply and replicate some of your results in this new context.
Great.
I'm sure we could talk about this for hours, but I'm afraid we are a bit short on time, and we should go on to our Q&A session. And I wanted to circle back to Catalina. John mentioned the ice on the road, and you've written a lot about the dark web. Do you see any antitrust issues to come in the dark web, which would potentially be of relevance to these issues?
Yeah, so I'm just going to share one of the studies that I've been involved in. So the dark web is just something that I'm completely fascinated with. And I think that there are quite a lot of parallels actually with a lot of the blockchain communities, because I've done some socio-legal work on this, not just the web measurement study that I shared, but I coined together with a colleague, a legal philosopher, the term of crypto community. So a community that really uses cryptography for many different functions of the community activity. And we see that on the dark web, and we also see that in the blockchain space. And when it comes to, antitrust issues that can occur on the dark web, I think that you can name any kind of, I'm not an antitrust scholar myself, but I think that it's just fair game to have any kind of collusion, any kind of agreements between different marketplaces, because this is supposed to be, a very informal market that exists in an illegal space. Well, some would argue in a very illegal space. So we have been looking at data markets on the dark web. And what I can tell you, just a couple of anecdotes, apart from the fact that we found a marketplace that mentioned in its terms of service that it's run exclusively by women. So it was like a feminist marketplace, which, it's something very funny to see. What we noticed is that a lot of marketplaces offered a lot of interoperability. So they allowed different sellers to actually bring their reputation systems, their scores from one market to another. They also did some geo-blocking. So they were blocking sellers from very specific marketplaces. But then, of course, because the consideration is that there are just no rules on the dark web, then you can conspire with any actors you wish, and then engage in any kind of behavior that you think is going to be better for your own marketplace. The fascinating thing, or the fascinating discovery, is that to a certain extent, even from an ethical perspective, there are some limits. And so, for instance, child sexual abuse material is prohibited in a lot of dark web marketplaces. So they do take a stance on some ethical parts, but when it comes to actually making money, I think that there are no antitrust rules, on the dark web. And perhaps the one consideration, and maybe just to loop back to what John was mentioning, the idea is that on the dark web, there's quite a lot of law enforcement activity. And I think that law enforcement has been, in many ways, in a positive way, but also perhaps in some detrimental ways. Law enforcement has been, I think, one of the first entities to start looking at how to computationally measure harms and how to also forensically identify harms and perpetrators on the dark web. So I think that when it comes to computational antitrust, just like what is happening right now in the field of consumer protection, where data units are being set up around the world to try to understand consumer harms, there needs to be a little bit more coordination between different types of enforcement authorities who are interested in perhaps similar behaviors, but then from different legal perspectives. So if I may kind of just bounce this also back to John, did you have any kind of ideas on this, or was this something that you were considering when you were writing the paper, the coordination and the translation of what you're mentioning in the context of computational antitrust, also beyond antitrust authorities?
Right. Well, that's one of the things that we can get into, and that's part of the ecosystem as described by Thibault in his work. that we used. So we were looking at things about, well, whether it's a public or a private blockchain type of thing. And there's a question in the chat that I think kind of goes, or in the Q&A area that goes to this as, you know, well, what's the difference really? Why blockchain versus some of the other databases or things that are around? And it has to do with what you're referring to exactly is this level of trust. Because that was, I had wasn't my student, but I was on the dissertation panel for a student that was looking at the contagion in the 2008 financial crisis, and this lack of trust, and no one knew who had the bad securities, and they knew there were a lot of them out there, and all of these types of things, but how do you track that type of thing? And I think having perhaps, and as you described the dark web, that's almost the global economic system when we get out there into the wilds, right, of people doing more exotic things, I think is the proper term, with their investments and these other things, and to use something like this open ledger technology to be able to track, well, who's holding these types of things, what are these investments, and where these things are. But then we get into some of the things, and it always in my mind keeps going back to cryptocurrency and the implosion of I believe it was FTX, the trading firm, and so we see, well, like Bitcoin itself is very public, right? It's a public blockchain that everybody can see what's going on and what's been going on, but yet these other private tokens that are supposed to be backed by securities and all these other types of things, they're all subject to the same issues we have with any other type of commodity. It's really only as good as the trust you can establish, and what can I see? How do I know I can trust you? Particularly if we're both in the dark web, if we're both criminals, how do I know that you're on the up and up with me? Particularly if I can't necessarily find you to do something terrible to you if you are untrustworthy. So I guess that's the main thing about this technology, is the ability to establish that trust without having to have any of the social capital involved that normally goes along with trust. So it's kind of a fascinating sociological type of event that as we get into it, which is exactly what the law is all about. So I don't know.
Thanks a lot, John and Catalina, for both responding to two questions in one go. That's quite impressive. I have one final question. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for any other question for Daza. So you touched upon this a bit before, where you were talking about the agent-based models and potential other models which could be used perhaps in AI applications. What in your experience, if you look at the glass bowl that you may have at home, what computational law solutions do you think antitrust researchers would benefit from exploring? Is it purely agent-based modeling? Is it absolutely AI, or are there other computational law solutions which would be particularly relevant in researching?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I'll just answer in the context of this panel and this exploration of agent-based modeling. I actually think the best thing to look at is one level up from specific technologies or tools or models, and it is I guess I'd say it's the principle that we ought to be able to apply the law in a refactored way so that we treat information as data, and that the instruments of law and the legal processes can also occur in less of a sort of manual, assumed manual kind of analysis and kind of paper paradigm, even if it's PDFs, kind of context, but something that's more more based on data and occurs as a result of models, and that becomes the the methods and the mechanisms for the practice of law and regulation and legal analysis and action. And so I would just be asking, and like a more pointed question is, what are the opportunities to shorten the cycle for things, so people aren't necessarily waiting 6 months or 2 years or longer to know the result of, to know whether something was or wasn't antitrust, or to get an approval for a merger or something like this? Could we utilize these technologies for more dynamic and also adaptive systems, so that we can start to load the values that we seek into these systems and adjust them when we need more competition, when we need more stability, and as social and economic and political goals change? These are some of the promises of computational law, and the challenge is, can you apply these tools to achieve this outcome?
Yeah, there's a lot of room for exploration there. That's true. Thanks a lot for that response, Daza. And thanks a lot to all of our panelists who came and spoke. It was extremely interesting, extremely stimulating to hear you speak together. And I can see Thibault popped back into the room with his camera on, and I think I will pass the floor to him.
Yes, thanks a lot. While we wait for Scott to be promoted, let me just say two things. First, we mentioned yesterday the NLLP conference. Katerina is one of the co-organizers. We've put the link in the chat. Also, we mentioned that last year, but I want to make it sure that you have on the radar the MIT Computational Law report. I've also put the link in the chat. It's absolutely fantastic, created by Daza. And last year, I've asked Daza actually to send one of the hats that he has every time I see Daza on the panel, and he actually did. So I'm a very proud owner of the law.mit.edu hat. That's where it gets to the MIT Computational Law report.